Okay, welcome back. Please open your camera. Today, we are very honored to have Mr. Krish Chetty here. He's gonna give us a lecture related to BRICS cooperation models. And Krish Chetty is a researcher and data warehouse developer at Human Science Research Council. As a team leader to work on the data analysis and management of BRICS data warehouse, he is a researcher in knowledge and information management, BRICS research and fintech, and have many relevant work experience in financial and fiscal commission, First National Bank, corporate segment, and at Alan Gray Financial Management. In August 2015, he won first prize at the BRICS Young Scientist Contest in Russia. Wow. So let's welcome him to give us the lecture.
Well, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Wu. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, colleagues. It's a great privilege and honor for me to be addressing you today. My thanks to Fudan University for inviting me. My name is Krish Chetty, as Ms. Wu has said, and I'm a researcher now at the Human Sciences Research Council based in Cape Town in South Africa. So very happy to talk to you today and share some of my research that I've done into BRICS cooperation models and some of the ideas that we have about promoting knowledge exchanges across BRICS to advance socio-economic development. So welcome, and I look forward to the session. I'm just thinking about that last question that we had at the end of the last session, and it was about what are the BRICS actually doing right now to be promoting more cooperation in dealing with this crisis that's affecting all of us. It's ongoing, and we've been talking about cooperation and those sorts of things for many years now, but when it comes down to the nuts and bolts, that's where it gets very difficult for these high ideas that are captured amongst the leaders to actually translate into action. So my work today is looking at what can we do to actually promote this sort of cooperation and have some sort of real change. In terms of my presentation, I have 5 broad sections that I'd like to work through today. I start off by giving you a crash course in knowledge sharing theory. I then speak about why knowledge sharing is so important amongst the BRICS countries. And I follow the theory with 2 practical cases in how we could build partnerships between Africa and China, for example, in either the fintech space or in the renewable energy sector. And then my last section is about discussing some ideas we've had about building a knowledge sharing platform across the BRICS. So to begin, I'd like to start with some theory about sharing knowledge. If you'd like to get a deeper understanding of these concepts, I recommend the textbook Managing Knowledge Work and Innovation by Newell and some of her co-authors, which you'd see here. So what is knowledge? Perhaps many of you are familiar with this Ackoff hierarchy, this pyramid that you see in the slide. This suggests that data with some context can then become information. Information added with some meaning can become knowledge, and knowledge with some insight perhaps can become wisdom. This framework assumes that knowledge is grounded in data and it's something that can be possessed. But is knowledge actually a possession? What about tacit knowledge, something that is unwritten, only understood? Can something not be learned by doing it? Where you learn something through repeated practice. You also have other people that are following Plato's thinking, and they think that knowledge is justified true belief. But how do you know what is true? Does it matter if your idea is actually false? And then lastly, also in the software space and in the digital economy, there's a question now about whether knowledge can actually be digitized. Can it exist outside of the mind? Is Wikipedia, for example, a store of knowledge, or is it just information? So looking over the literature, there's multiple definitions of knowledge, And our philosophers, basically, they don't agree on what it is. It makes it very hard for us to develop an actual strategy to share knowledge if the underlying concept is misunderstood. Swan, for example, in 2008, describes it as an ability to discriminate within and across contexts. So you can discriminate, meaning that you should have some ability to make some judgments. Sokas and Vladimiro in 2001, they talk about a person being able to make distinctions within a particular domain. And they also bring in that idea of action. You know something and therefore you can act. And many want to make a connection between knowledge and digitization, but they fail to recognize the importance of tacit knowledge. And there's also an idea of organizational knowledge, this being a set of norms or understanding that bring workers together to produce collective outcomes given a specific context. My own professor from university, he tried to come up with his own theory, and he embraced the field of sense making. And he said knowledge is an ability to make sense and act accordingly. So there's predominantly two main discourses, one where knowledge is a possession and another where knowledge is a practice, something that's learned by doing. And then the key idea is whether having this knowledge has some influence on you to make you act. So basically it comes down to this point which impacts us all. We all believe in sharing knowledge, but how do you do this if you can't define it? So for us to navigate the space and develop strategies for sharing knowledge, we need to understand how knowledge gets created in an organization. Nonaka and Takeuchi in 1995, they developed what is known as the SECI or SECI model, which describes the cyclical process of us creating and sharing knowledge. And this is a predominant model where most researchers in the knowledge management discourse refer to. Nonaka was actually quite taken by the special relationship between a bread maker and his apprentice. The manner in which the apprentice learned by assimilation, by absorption. He wondered, how does one actually capture this unique relationship in understanding what knowledge is and how it's created and then shared? And so he was inspired by this relationship, and he put together the SECI model, which was informed about us sharing knowledge between people. So SECI is an acronym. It refers to socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. Socialization is the first step in the cycle. And this refers to us sharing tacit knowledge. It's like the baker's understanding about the unique consistency of the bread dough. It's something that you can't explain in words, but rather by sharing a feeling. The externalization, this occurs when one tries to convert the tacit knowledge into an explicit form. So here that young apprentice he's trying to write down the steps or to codify what he's learned. Combination, the next step, is when the young apprentice now starts thinking about combining with what he's learned with other recipes that he's read about or he knows of, other explicit forms of knowledge that he has access to. And then by combining recipes, you can start to create something new. And then internalization, that's in the process of learning. This is where you've tried merging recipes. Sometimes it failed, sometimes it works. And in so doing, you're learning and you're internalizing the process. And once you've learned something, you can then choose to share it again. And then you go back into the whole socialization phase and the process repeats. And within the organization, there's a few ideas you also need to be aware of. Which organization type here is best set up for learning? So if we contrast the bureaucracy to the adhocracy, there are various pros and cons. The bureaucracy is an organization which is generally hierarchical with centralized control. This organization has strict rules which determine how people meet and exchange ideas. And here it's very difficult for one to make changes or to learn something new. If you want to think about a model, think about the army, very structured, very strict. The adhocracy is the opposite type of organization. This one is flexible. There's few to no rules. It's generally flatter and it's easier to exchange information. across the organization. It makes it easier for you to produce new ideas. But there's a tension now. How do you actually go about managing this process when it's so unstructured? The best learning organizations try to have some sort of blended approach. They're promoting steps for sharing information, but they're also trying to cut down the hierarchies so that you have more functioning management mechanisms. It's also important for us to understand what trust is. Trust is essential for entering into an agreement and having a partnership. And there's three main forms of trust. It's companion, competence, and commitment. And when you talk about companion trust, this is built between social connections through friendships. Here, by knowing someone, you can start to make a moral judgment about the caliber of the person and whether you want to work with them going forward. Competence trust is when you see the quality of their work and you recognize their talent and you understand their ability to get the job done, and that spurs you on to work more closely. And then the last one is commitment trust. This form of trust is produced when you have a contract to fall back on. You might not know the person, you might not know their work, but you have the contract, which then protects you and gives you some sense of security about what the other person is obligated to do and to carry out what is agreed. And once you understand how trust gets created, you can also appreciate the role that boundary spanners play in an organization. These are people who operate in multiple teams and get exposure to different environments and cultures and problems. And by working closely with someone outside from your circle, outside from your space, you start to build that companion trust and competence trust if you actually know what you're doing. And with few people crossing over teams, you can then start to also cut down what we call the silo mentality, and you break down those patterns of gatekeeping where people are holding on to something that they think secures their job. And importantly, it's these people that are in the middle. They are the ones who can then act as knowledge brokers. And that's a very important point, which we'll come back to when we go over some real world problems. So now that you've had a crash course on knowledge management theory, you must be asking, what is this for? What can I do with it? And in the real world, there's a few key points that we need to remember. We need strategies to free up knowledge so that it can be shared and not limited to a specific team or location. We need to also understand that knowledge is intangible, but it has immense economic value. How do you make that bread if you don't understand what the right consistency of the dough is? That's what's intangible. How do we organize ourselves so that we allow for knowledge creation, but also enable us to manage that process? And lastly, we also need to know that knowledge is not only produced in the R&D department or by those super academics. There's great value in actually understanding the context and understanding problems and where they actually reside. So understanding these knowledge concepts, why is it important for the BRICS? So the BRICS heads of state have repeatedly been calling for mechanisms for knowledge sharing. It's been explicitly stated in every declaration produced by the group, and it cuts across all fields. In recent years, there have been some notable agreements. Last year, they spoke about drafting a BRICS economic partnership, and then also setting up some sort of strategy for partnerships among medium, small, and micro enterprises. In 2019, there was collaboration, there were calls for collaboration in TB research, and they also started what's called the BRICS Energy Research Cooperation Platform. Going further back, 2018, the focus was on promoting people-to-people cooperation, and the group also launched the Vaccine Research and Development Center. So each of these initiatives have been agreed to, but there's a need for us to institutionalize these agreements. We need to work out those nuts and bolts required for building the partnership. And how do we do this when we know the BRICS are so far apart and we've got so many barriers to preventing us building trust amongst ourselves? Knowing that these barriers also exist, the BRICS Think Tank Council has identified 5 areas of research. And the 5th pillar of research for all BRICS countries is knowledge and innovation sharing. And it was up to the council then to develop strategies that promote knowledge sharing. And so their work has involved recommending collaboration across tracks, where we're creating linkages between government or business or academia or civil society. However, what we know is that for any strategy to work, we also need to back it up with some money or other resources so that the council, so with that in mind, the council has then gone about recommending us pooling resources for this sort of thing. There's also been a focus on us setting up technologies that can help us promote the exchange of knowledge. But we must ask, what do we do about sharing that tacit knowledge? That's an important aspect. And lastly, there's also been calls for us to set up some sort of centralized framework for funding BRICS collaboration and research, which could follow examples from the European FP7 model, which collates funding across all their different R&D sectors. However, the council has struggled to come up with some comprehensive strategies which can overcome those barriers to knowledge sharing. And this is where our work can come in to feed into their high-level ideas. In the BRICS, we all know our countries have different cultures and languages, but beyond that, there's some deeper barriers. Data is key to innovation and policy creation. But for us to access granular data about our countries, that's been limited. And when new information is created, it's often only documented in our home languages. And this makes it more difficult for access to understand the content that's coming out of the country. Same goes for our stats when they're produced. It's in local languages. In addition, apart from us trying to foster intra-BRICS collaboration, within each country, we have to promote collaboration across our sectors. Business tends to work independently from research, which tends to be separate from the university. We need to break down these silos within the country while we're also trying to promote collaboration outside of the country with our BRICS partners. And if we do manage to start some sort of collaborative project, we have to solve difficult questions about ownership, funding of the idea, how this formation will get managed. And lastly, we're all very protective of our intellectual property. And so we need some sort of incentive to share the intellectual property, which could be our competitive advantage and perhaps the secret to your business's sustainability. So with these barriers in mind, what can we do to overcome this? So knowing more about these issues, let's look at a real life example. Can we try to solve a socially complex problem through knowledge sharing? And here's some of my ideas that I've worked on in the HSRC, but also in partnership with colleagues from Zhejiang University in China. The fintech industry is of great relevance in China and across the African continent. And so for us to grow the fintech industry, we believe this will help us start to expand financial inclusion in Africa in particular, and in this fashion, start to solve some problems of poverty. However, when we compare the fintech sectors in China and Africa, we're aware of the vast disparities in our capability. China has a very mature sector with mega companies, while on the African continent, many of the entrepreneurs have just entered the market and they're very vulnerable. However, the question is, how do we build the African sector while also protecting the African interest? And how do we do so in a way that's beneficial to our Chinese counterparts so they're incentivized to come and work with us? So when we start talking about advancing financial inclusion in Africa, there's a few points I want you to consider. Firstly, we're talking about partnerships with China, and China's Belt and Road Initiative has specifically targeted growing the financial architecture along this belt, which runs from China all the way into the African continent. And this sort of architecture, these systems, these are considered essential infrastructure for us to promote trade and mutual growth. And when we talk about growth in Africa, we actually mean inclusive growth that benefits all people, not just the deal makers. And advancing financial inclusion is one mechanism for more people to be able to participate in the formal economy. However, the drivers of financial inclusion are different in every country and community. And a one-size-fits-all strategy for access to fintech could fail. So there's a need for us to understand both the demand and the supply factors which affect financial inclusion. Before entering into a partnership, the African fintech sector needs to understand its strengths and its weaknesses and know in what ways, if it wants to partner with a Chinese counterpart, how can it do so, and what would be the expectations for this partnership. From the Chinese side, their investors would need some guidance on how to navigate the risks of venturing into a foreign market. So the question is, who can play these roles and help them find the information that they need? So as I mentioned, to promote financial inclusion in Africa, it's important that we understand those demand and supply factors. And our study helped us develop this pyramid. And when we talk about the demand side, we're referring to the needs of the customer. And on the supply side, we're talking about the needs of those who supply the services, our startups, our innovators and entrepreneurs. So we need to support both the consumer and the entrepreneur to adequately build the sector. And the financial sector and so a financial sector that only has one service supplier will be very weak. So we need to understand what the supplier's needs are. From the consumer side, they need products that are easier to access, that are affordable. They need the skills and the knowledge of how to navigate a platform where it's made available. And these sorts of services need to be widely available and interoperable with the various systems that are there so that different providers can have access to it. And then that can promote widespread adoption. At the same time, we must consider how to support the developers. For them to be successful, they need the technological and business skills and capability to start offering a service. Then they need a large capital investment or collateral to secure their licenses and other sorts of things. And then beyond that, they need knowledge about the regulatory framework and also an understanding about local markets. And also understanding what the consumers actually value and what problems they need solving. So if these factors on both sides of the pyramid are in balance, you can then start to develop a sustainable fintech sector. The question is for us, how might a foreign partnership help offer valuable services to customers while also building the local fintech entrepreneurs? It's also important for us to put the challenges faced in Africa into context. Firstly, looking at the access challenge, the top graph shows how far behind the African countries are actually from China when it comes to internet access. Going up to 2017, in China, it was reported that nearly 55% of all its people in both the rural and the urban areas had some sort of internet access. But in comparison, access in African regions is much lower. And so these lines show access in Central, East, Southern and West Africa. And in Southern and East Africa, it's about 35% of all people. Well, but if you come down to Central Africa, it's only about 8% of people. And we also know that mobile devices are tending to be increasing. And we see trends with some households owning more than one device or SIM card. But still, we fall far shorter than what's going on in China, where as at 2018, where this data comes from, China had nearly 120 devices per 100 people in 2018. Whereas if you look at Central Africa, they're struggling the most, and that hovers at around 60 devices per 100 people. And most importantly, in Africa, across the regions, most of these devices are only 2G compatible. So that ranges between 61% to 93% of devices can only work on a 2G service. So we need low-tech solutions in these areas that is aligned to the capability of people. In the payment space, the top chart is also showing us some great disparities in how the internet is used. In China, over 40% of the country uses the internet to buy something or pay its bills online. In Africa, that ranges between 2% to 9%. What also drives the payment sector in Africa is the need to send remittances. This is actually more prevalent in Africa than it is in China right now. And actually it's most popular in East Africa. So for investors that are interested in Africa, remittance-based solutions might be their entry point. If you understand the demands that people have and the quality of their existing solutions. And when it comes to savings, there's also a very strong savings culture, which is actually not recognized in the formal sector. Informal savings through what we call savings clubs are very popular across sub-Saharan Africa. And this is actually preferred to formal financial institutions, which is quite the opposite to what you find in China. And the question is, why do poor communities prefer informal savings clubs? Here's a typical picture of what a savings club meeting looks like in Kenya. It's very well attended, and the community is very interested in what's happening to their money. But this is what some of their ledgers look like. So you can start to understand the risk that's involved in these manual processes. But the question is, why do people still prefer this to working with a bank? Is it related to the access issue? Is it affordability? Is it language? Is it trust? Is it a combination of factors? The people that have the answers to this are those that are working with the savings club and people that work with the community. So if you can harness the energy that's developing around these savings products, that could be another entry point to the market. So these last few slides, they give you a sense of the challenges affecting consumers. However, the fintech entrepreneur also experiences quite a few challenges. These businesses, as I mentioned, they're very vulnerable, and we have a high failure rate of about 60 to 80% among startups in Africa, depending on which region you're in. So being so vulnerable, they need access to quality incubators and accelerators that can nurture them through the startup process while also helping share expert knowledge. And once the startup also overcomes those first hurdles of defining what their business model is, they then need to go out and convince investors to give them money. In South Africa, for example, you need 250 million rand to get a banking license. That's 125 million renminbi. And that's just the threshold to get your first banking license. From there, you'll need further funding. So that threshold is quite the barrier, and it serves to exclude most of the startups from actually gaining entry to the market. And many of them are then forced to partner with the banks that exist in the country who are actually their competitors. And so that ends up just killing off many of the ideas. And so we're basically promoting monopolies by having such policies. And lastly, our regulatory processes are quite restrictive, and they're not allowing new businesses to enter the market. And there'd be great benefit for us in Africa if we could follow a similar process to what's going on in China, where you have looser regulations based on the level of risk that the business actually presents to the market. So that helps incentivize new innovators to enter the market. But it also says to us that we need some partnerships with our regulators as well, so that they can understand how the Chinese model is working, and then for us to be sharing that sort of knowledge. And while the startup does face several barriers, they also have some unique strengths that make them attractive to international partners. Firstly, many startups can appreciate the unique challenges of the market, and they understand the needs of the market, and they've developed products which are specific to these needs. In contrast, we actually find the formal banking sector is not customizing their products or aligning their cost structures to what people are capable of paying. And so they're not catering to the low income consumer, which is in the vast majority across Africa. And we also know that these startups possess a wealth of tacit knowledge, local market knowledge, which should indicate we need to have models which then help us share this tacit knowledge, because it's extremely valuable, and it's produced in a market where data is scarce. So we don't have access to social media. And so our consumers are not actually visible in our big stores of big data. And so their needs are very often invisible to product developers. So understanding the unique nature of Africa's fintech sector, how might partnership building and knowledge sharing actually strengthen Africa's fintech sector? So in the next few slides, I give you a few ideas about that. As I've mentioned, many of the startups are quite new to the market. They're very vulnerable, and they need to identify institutions that can protect them on their journey. And you need a specific institution to support them based on their level of maturity. And so when the startup first wants to launch, they need to develop an idea, and then they need to turn that into a business plan. At that point, they need assistance from an incubator. This is where you nurture the idea and you help the startup access capital investments to help them build the business. Thereafter, the startup needs to secure a banking license, which, as I mentioned, is quite expensive. And then partnerships at that stage will be very helpful to, one, secure the capital, and then also overcome the regulatory red tape which follows. And once they've passed that stage, they're still vulnerable because now they're entering the market and they have to compete with the existing players. And that's where accelerators can come in, and they can help scale the business, also protecting them, but also helping them work with potential partners. So those incubators and the accelerators, they play very crucial roles in protecting a business, and they're excellent vehicles for outside interests to approach a country and identify potential partners. Based on a recent scan by GSMA, we have about 680 incubators or accelerators spread across the continent, and they're mostly located in our big metros like Cape Town or Nairobi in Kenya. Government is also invested in these incubators, but these incubators also need support, as many of them themselves are vulnerable and they're also new to the market, and they might not have the best advice for the startups that they are meant to protect. So we need to be supporting the hubs as well. And a key point for building partnerships and to begin exchanging knowledge and information would be to identify those boundary spanners or intermediaries that I worked with. And in the fintech sector, there are 3 bodies who can play this role, as I mentioned. It's the incubators, it's the accelerators, and they, as I mentioned, they're tasked to nurture the development of these organizations. But then you also have fintech associations, which are becoming much more prevalent across the continent. And they can help you connect with the players in the sector. And these institutions, they can help initiate partnership buildings with their peers in foreign countries, as they have that local, social, cultural, political, economic, and even regulatory knowledge of their environment. And these institutions can act on behalf of their members and act as a buffer when dealing with the foreign party. And that's quite crucial, because you need to be able to protect the startups when you're entering into these delicate negotiations with a fintech giant like you might find in China. And these institutions can also engage their counterparts and set up dialogues and begin exchanging knowledge. So with greater interaction, that's where you start to build that companion trust. The association or the incubators, they could pool their resources and then also work to secure translators who can assist with language translation, cultural translations. And with more conversations, we expect we'd have a deeper exchange of knowledge, allowing us to exchange regulatory and product knowledge, which is critical to developing a partnership. And once we've been able to develop the trust and we've achieved that shared perspective, there's 4 possible partnership models that I want to speak to that could exist between the Chinese and African stakeholder. The first model involves having a Chinese partner securing a minor stake of equity, i.e. they're making a capital investment in a specific startup that's really aligned to their objectives. But this requires that they actually have some understanding of the market and the strengths of the startup. And this investment could then also help assist that startup improve the service and the support that it offers, and the support that it receives from the incubator or the accelerator. The second model involves the Chinese partner identifying a high potential startup, and it offers it the information and guidance about how to offer a particular product or service. And so here the African partner can implement the product, but they also have unique knowledge helping shape the product. And this strategy takes advantage of Chinese technological expertise, but also the African partners' knowledge of local conditions. And then they set up some sort of profit sharing agreement that's in line with their partnership. The third model involves the Chinese partner actually acquiring a local African company so they could quickly enter the market. But while this approach might be faster, it's more complex, and you've got to think about all the different legal issues which exist in this sort of arrangement. The other challenge here is that the Chinese business could likely fail if it doesn't acquire knowledge about the local context. And then the last potential partnership model involves the Chinese and the fintech firm both deciding to start a new venture separate from their current organizations. This might take longer to set up, but it sets up very clear partnership parameters. And then all the proceeds actually remain within the new venture. And this also helps them leverage their collective skills and knowledge from both organizations, but it is the most expensive option to set up. So to conclude in this section, partnerships and knowledge sharing can help build the capabilities of the fintech sector, but you need to be aware of a few points. Local knowledge is critical for the success of the venture. There's also a need for us to support and develop the capabilities of the fintech innovator, and our incubators and accelerators and association can really perform that role and help share knowledge within the sector. And there's also a need for us to expand the prevalence of fintech associations across the continent. It's still a new space, and so the governments need to play a role here supporting their establishment. And when you consider partnerships, I've shown you 4 potential models which we could adopt. In the renewable energy space, there's some similar themes here which I'd like to go over. As I've mentioned, when we discuss the need for knowledge sharing and cooperation, this is a well-accepted position in the BRICS group going all the way back to 2009 when it was still BRIC. And it's the same for energy. So if the BRICS are supporting the idea, our research needs to shift to modalities of knowledge exchange. How do we actually do it? So if we can build closer ties, we will be able to accelerate our transition away from fossil fuels, reducing emissions, and trying to move towards renewable energy dependence. And a key vehicle for us to build these partnerships is something that's been set up recently, which I mentioned earlier, the BRICS Energy Research Cooperation Platform. But this platform really needs to be expanded. It's a new idea, but it needs to really include contributions from local government and the private sector and various associations and academics. To facilitate these engagements, we also think it's important that we introduce consulate officers so they can also help us drive these partnership creation. As I mentioned, the BRICS have been supporting this idea of knowledge sharing. It goes back to 2009. And this institution, it's been the Research Cooperation Platform. It's been asked to drive sustainable development, promote sharing advanced technology, expand cooperation programs in the education space, and connect us in these various forums, be it the academic forum or science, technology, and innovation forums, and so on. But these engagements are basically facilitated at the level of ministers. And so we need to expand it down to that local level. This matrix is drawn from reports published by the BRICS Energy Research Cooperation Platform's 2020 report, and it talks about the strengths and our areas for exchange. So a green block is something that we feel we're strong in. The red block is telling us where we need help or where we need to partner. So if we look across the spectrum of the renewable energies, we can see which countries can take the lead. So for example, in the solar space, China's number one. They've got a long history in developing that sort of infrastructure. In the wind space, Russia talks about needing gearboxes for their turbines, but then you have India, which has a strong manufacturing process, and they can play a role. In the battery space, South Africa is producing the raw materials that are needed. And Brazil and India are also saying that they need this sort of resources to build their capacity. So for each of these fields, we have this high level overview, but we need to know who are those key people that can actually play a role in leading the work in this space. And like I've said, in the fintech sector, you have renewable energy associations. They can also play a role and be those entry points for us to engage with the relevant actors and open up the space for new innovations. The association is non-profit, and they work to support their network of members, many who are also fledgling businesses and vulnerable, just like in the fintech sector. And they're connected to the private sector, academia, and some also involve regulators. But they have those deep insights of the local market, and they can act as those buffers, really protecting the interests of their members, which like what we've spoken about in the fintech space. So these are the ideal actors that we should be working with in this energy research cooperation platform. So again, we have a similar knowledge sharing model in mind, like what you've seen in the fintech space. And this will allow us to include our renewable energy associations and consulate offices. So these institutions should be included in that cooperation platform because they're better placed to build trust, particularly among those vulnerable innovators. And in this instance, the consulate office also plays an important role because they have resources that can assist with language and cultural translations, and they have a mandate to be developing these sorts of partnerships. So they need to be brought on board as well. And thereafter, then you have your energy associations, which can help set up dialogues, talk about the regulatory framework, describe local insights, and look at the available resources. And as I mentioned, they then also can protect those innovators when you're talking about setting up partnerships. So to close this section, it's essential for research cooperation platforms to be further expanded and also for us to include renewable energy associations, your local governments, and your academic institutions into the platform. And our international relations ministries in the BRICS, they have a key role to also facilitate these partnerships. And we should use their consulate offices because they have that network already, which can help us identify strategic partners who are interested in entering into international partnerships. Yeah, and then these offices, they take the role in promoting dialogues, exchange programs, developing some sort of research agenda at the local level. But again, for us to facilitate these objectives, money is always needed. So we call upon the new development bank to make funds available, which could nurture the creation of knowledge partnerships, and perhaps these funds could be accessed by the consulate office. Ms. Wu, how am I doing for time? Should we start to take questions soon?
Yeah, if you still want to present more, you can maybe present 10 more minutes, and then we maybe can only have one question raised for you.
I've got a few more slides. I've got another section. Take me about 5 minutes to go through.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, great. Okay, so the last section that I have is looking at an idea to promote knowledge sharing. And this idea was how do we go about setting a knowledge sharing platform? This could be a website or an app which is dedicated to connecting people. And at the moment, we've got several BRICS websites which you could go look up, and they're owned by a range of actors, be it our foreign affairs departments or statistical agencies, but they're basically one-way communication. We're not promoting proper communication across the BRICS, and we're not trying to solve those problems of language translation. So our information is basically trapped behind these barriers. So we need ideas which can help us solve these problems and make this information more accessible. With that problem that we face is that we don't have these mechanisms to be able to connect with our peers across the BRICS. And technology perhaps is our option to overcome the distance barrier that we're facing. So our proposal was to develop an online platform which allows us to share knowledge and ideas for our new innovations. And so in this platform, we'd invite researchers, businesses, investors, governments, and the general public to be able to come onto the site and then interact across the BRICS. And this would allow us to integrate crowd processes to find new ideas, giving us a tool to collectively collaborate in further expanding upon our ideas, and then give us that opportunity to perhaps attract funding for popular ideas. But as we do this, it's also very crucial that we embed language translation facilities into the site so that we're translating all our text so that we really address that language barrier from the outset. So how would we actually do this? On the innovation side, one would go online, and you're posting an idea. And you're inviting others that wish to work with you to then comment on this idea. And so you then, once they've seen it, you then have an expansion of this idea, and you start to communicate. But we're suggesting let's not do this over email where you have this chaotic exchange of information. Let's do it in a centralized manner, following some sort of wiki process or open document where you can start to engage on the one site. And then beyond that, we can then use this also to engage with funders centrally, because we're posting all our ideas on one platform, which is shared across the BRICS. And then the funders would know where to go to look for new ideas that they should support. And everything that we do here, we're suggesting needs to be supported with a language translation facility across the board. And when it comes to information sharing, we could use this platform for researchers to set up platforms which might share some of their work. So this site would allow you to look up experts, find their work, find their colleagues, and engage in that space. And we also propose some functionality that allows you to comment on the work, but also have some crucial features that this is also translated so that we can start to more openly communicate across the countries. So to conclude here, we need funding for such an idea. It's the technologies are out there, but we need to invest in such a platform so that we can promote this sort of communication. And it would also allow us to centralize how we collaborate across the countries. And if we embed language translation tools, we're also starting to promote more open communication across the BRICS. And a key barrier for us at this point, we have the ideas, but we don't have the funding. And who takes ownership? Who takes control? Who starts to drive it? If everybody in the BRICS is an equal partner, who actually leads? So that's a complicated question that we need to try to find answers for. But these are the sorts of things that we need. We need practical ideas that can help us start to promote cooperation. So to conclude, it's important that you remember knowledge is both tacit and explicit. For a successful knowledge sharing strategy, you also need to think about what it takes to share the knowledge that might only be available in someone's mind. And a key element for us to exchange knowledge or to set up a partnership is for us to establish trust. And in the BRICS space, this is harder than it generally is because of the distance and the language and the cultural barriers that we face. In addition, our startup businesses are very vulnerable, particularly here in Africa. So we need some sort of intermediary institutions that can act as buffers and protect them during early negotiations. And then that will help ease their fears, make them feel more comfortable about making contact with their peers, so that we don't lose their intellectual property. And when you do get around trying to enter into a foreign market, having local knowledge is critical for the success of the idea. And my final point is, when we take this forward, we need problem solvers. We need people who are interested in finding practical solutions. And I hand the baton over to you. You could be that person, someone who sees a problem and goes out to find a solution and help bring us together, talking, working together. Thank you very much. I'll take questions.
Okay. Be positive a little bit.